At 9:17 on the morning of January 22, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George crouched in the ruins of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz, watching a banyan tree 240 yards away through a scope his fellow officers had laughed at for 6 weeks. He was 27 years old, Illinois state rifle champion, and so far, 0 confirmed kills. The Japanese had 11 snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves. In the previous 72 hours, they had killed 14 men from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. George's commanding officer had called his rifle a toy. The other platoon leaders called it his mail-order sweetheart. Months earlier, at Camp Forest in Tennessee, George had unpacked a Winchester Model 70 with a Lyman Alaskan scope on a Griffin and Howe mount. The armorer wanted to know if it was meant for deer or Germans. George explained it was for the Japanese. Then the battalion shipped out before the rifle arrived. George spent the voyage to Guadalcanal, watching other men clean their M1 Garans, while his own rifle sat in a warehouse in Illinois. He requested it be forwarded through military mail. 6 weeks later, in late December 1942, a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate marked fragile. Inside was the rifle he had spent 2 years of National Guard pay to buy. The Winchester weighed about 9 pounds. The scope and mount added more weight. The standard issue Garand carried by every other man in his battalion weighed roughly the same, but offered semi-automatic fire and iron sights only. George's rifle was bolt action, 5 rounds, with a hunting-style .3006 load. The Garand was semi-automatic, with an 8-round en-block clip. Captain Norris ordered him to leave the sporting rifle in his tent and carry a real weapon. George carried it anyway. The 132nd Infantry had relieved the Marines on Guadalcanal in late December 1942. The Marines had been fighting since August. They had taken Henderson Field and held it, but they had not taken Mount Austin, and they had not cleared the Japanese from the coastal groves west of the Matanika River. Mount Austin stood 1,514 feet high. The Japanese called the fortified area atop it the Gifu. It held roughly 500 men in 47 bunkers. George's battalion attacked on December 17th. They fought for 16 days, losing 34 men killed and 279 wounded before finally taking the western slope on January 2nd. By then, George had fired his Winchester exactly 0 times in combat. The jungle around Point Cruz was different. No concrete bunkers, no clear front line. Just Japanese soldiers who had retreated west from Henderson Field and dug into the massive trees. Some of those soldiers were snipers. They carried scoped Arisaka Type 99 rifles. They knew the jungle. They knew how to wait. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he was filling canteens at a creek. On January 20th, another sniper killed 2 men from L Company during a patrol. On January 21st, 3 more men died. One was shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had walked past twice. That night, the battalion commander summoned George. The Japanese snipers were killing his men faster than malaria. He needed someone who could shoot. He wanted to know if that mail-order rifle could actually hit anything. George explained his credentials. Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards in 1939. At age 23, he had been the youngest winner in the state's history. He could shoot 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights. With the Lyman Alaskan scope, he could keep 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards. The commander gave him until morning to prove it. George spent the night checking his rifle. The Winchester had been packed in Cosmoline for the long voyage. He cleaned it again. He checked the scope notes. He loaded 5 rounds of .3006, hunting ammunition he had brought from Tennessee, the same caliber as the standard military ball cartridge, but a different load. At dawn on January 22nd, George moved into position in the ruins of a Japanese bunker his battalion had captured 3 days earlier. The bunker overlooked the coconut and banyan groves west of Point Cruz. Intelligence said the Japanese snipers operated from the large banyan trees in that area. Some reached 90 feet tall with trunks 8 feet thick. A sniper could climb one before dawn and sit there all day without being seen. George brought no spotter, no radio man, just his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. He settled into the bunker and began to watch the trees through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan had 2.5x magnification. Not much, but enough to catch slight movements in the branches that the naked eye would miss. The jungle was never silent birds, insects, distant artillery. George had learned to filter out noise and focus on movement. He scanned the trees slowly, left to right, top to bottom dot at 9:17. He saw it. A branch moved. There was no wind, just a small shift 87 feet up in a banyan tree 240 yards away. George watched. The branch moved again. Then he saw the shape. A man in dark clothing, positioned in a fork where 3 branches met. The Japanese sniper was facing east, watching the trail where George's battalion had been moving supplies. George made a slight wind adjustment on his scope. He controlled his breathing. The Winchester's trigger was glass smooth, with a light, crisp pull he had painstakingly tuned at Camp Perry before the war. Now he would find out if a civilian target rifle could kill a man trained to kill him first. He squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked into his shoulder. The report cracked through the jungle. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked and fell. He dropped through the branches, tumbling nearly 90 feet before hitting the ground at the base of the banyan tree. George worked the bolt. The empty cartridge spun out. He chambered another round and kept his scope on the tree, waiting for movement. Nothing. The sniper's partner would be close. Japanese snipers worked in pairs, 1 shooter, 1 spotter. If George had just killed the shooter, the spotter was somewhere in that tree or in the surrounding canopy. George scanned the banyans nearby. With only 2.5x magnification, he had to search slowly. Each tree could hide multiple men. The jungle canopy threw deep shadows that turned shapes into dark, indistinct patches. At 9:43, he found the second sniper. Different tree, about 60 yards north of the first. This one was lower, maybe 50 feet up. The Japanese soldier was moving down the trunk, retreating. He had heard the shot and knew his position was compromised. George led the movement slightly and fired. The second sniper fell backwards off the tree. His rifle clattered through the branches ahead of him. Both hit the jungle floor within seconds. 2 shots. 2 kills. George reloaded his Winchester from the stripper clip. His hands were steady. His breathing stayed controlled. This was no different from Camp Perry, except the targets shot back. By 11:21, the Japanese were shooting back. A bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. The impact sprayed dirt into his face. He rolled left, pressing himself against the bunker wall. The shot had come from the southwest, a different direction from the first 2 snipers. He waited 3 minutes before moving, then eased back into position and scanned the trees to the southwest. Any competent sniper would relocate immediately after firing shoot and move. But in jungle this dense, relocation options were limited. At 11:38, George found him. 3rd tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans, 73 feet up. The Japanese sniper had shifted to a different branch, but stayed in the same tree. A mistake. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired. The 3rd sniper fell without a sound. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread through the battalion. Men who had mocked his mail-order rifle now wanted to watch him work. George refused. Spectators drew attention. Attention drew fire. The Japanese adapted quickly. After the fifth kill, they stopped moving during daylight. George spent the afternoon glassing trees and saw nothing. At 1600 hours, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris, no longer mocking, wanted him back in position at dawn. January 23rd began with heavy tropical rain that turned the jungle floor into mud and cut visibility down to less than 100 yards. George sat in the bunker and waited. The rain stopped at 8:15. By 8:45, he could see far enough to work. At 9:12, he spotted the first sniper of the day. This Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the rain, using the noise to mask movement. He had chosen a tree 290 yards out, longer range than the previous day. They were learning. George compensated for distance and fired. The sniper fell. The sixth kill brought a response George had not anticipated. At 9:57, Japanese mortar began hitting the area around his bunker. They had triangulated his position from muzzle flash or sound. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The second salvo landed 20 yards short. The third would be on target. George grabbed his rifle and ran, sprinting north along the tree line and diving into a shell crater as the third salvo hit. The bunker he had occupied moments before disappeared under explosions and flying debris. He relocated to a new position, a fallen tree 120 yards north of the destroyed bunker. The trunk provided cover and a clear view of the groves. George settled in and resumed his watch. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon. They knew he was hunting them. Now they were hunting him. The dynamic had changed. This was no longer target shooting. It was a duel. At 14:23, George killed his seventh sniper. At 15:41, he killed his eighth. That sniper had climbed high 94 feet up a banyan tree. The concealment was good, but at a certain sun angle, the height created a silhouette against the sky. At 1700 hours, Captain Morris sent a runner to pull George back. He had been in position for 9 hours. Morris wanted numbers. George reported 8 confirmed kills over 2 days. 12 rounds fired, 8 hits, 4 misses. Morris ordered him to continue sniper operations at dawn on January 24th. That night, George cleaned his Winchester and considered the math. Intelligence estimated 11 Japanese snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves. 8 were now dead. That left 3. Those 3 would be the best, the ones who had survived the longest. And now they knew exactly what George looked like and what rifle he carried. He loaded his Winchester with 5 fresh rounds and tried to sleep. At 3 o'clock, he gave up and sat in his tent with a rifle across his lap. Rain started again at 4:15. By 5:30, it was heavy enough to delay dawn operations. George used the time to move to a new position. Not the bunker, not the fallen tree. Somewhere the Japanese would not expect. He chose a cluster of large rocks about 70 yards south of his previous position, an old Marine machine gun nest from December. It offered solid cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. He settled in and waited for the rain to stop. At 7:43, the rain slowed to a drizzle. Visibility improved. George began glassing the trees. At 8:17 on January 24th, he found sniper number 9. This Japanese soldier was in a palm tree 190 yards out, only about 40 feet up. It was an unusual choice. Most snipers climbed higher for better sight lines. This one had chosen concealment over elevation. The palm fronds formed a natural hide that would be invisible from ground level. But George wasn't at ground level. The rocks gave him elevation. From that angle, he could see into the fronds. The dark shape of the sniper's shoulders and head was visible. George aimed, controlled his breathing, and began to squeeze the trigger. Then he stopped. Something was wrong. The position was too obvious too easy. After 3 days of hunting snipers and 8 kills, he knew the remaining men would not make elementary mistakes. They would not position themselves where an elevated shooter could easily spot them, unless it was bait. George lowered his rifle and scanned the surrounding trees. If the sniper in the palm was bait, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for anyone who took the shot, waiting for muzzle flash, ready to return fire. He checked every tree within 300 yards of the palm, methodically, left to right, top to bottom. 11 minutes past dot at 8:28. He found the real threat. A banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up. The Japanese sniper was in an excellent high branches and vines, concealing him from 3 sides. From that perch, he had a clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree. He was waiting for George to appear where he had been the day before, or to take the bait shot at the palm tree sniper. George now had 2 problems. First, the real sniper was watching the wrong location. If George fired at him, the sound would reveal his true position. The sniper could relocate before George worked the bolt and fired again. Second, if George did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize he wasn't at the fallen tree and start searching for him. George decided to use the bait against them. He aimed at the decoy sniper in the palm, made a wind adjustment, and fired. The decoy jerked and fell from the tree. Immediately, George swung his rifle toward the banyan, 91 feet up. The real sniper would react to the shot turn toward the sound. That turn would create movement. George saw it a slight shift as the sniper repositioned to face his location. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired before the sniper could complete the turn. The real sniper fell. His rifle tumbled after him. 2 shots, 2 kills. But George had revealed his position to anyone else watching. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition and ran east along the rocks, dropping into a drainage ditch about 40 yards away. He pressed into the mud and waited. At 8:34, Japanese machine gun fire raked the rocks where he had been seconds earlier. Bullets chewed stone and sand for 17 seconds. When the firing stopped, George counted to 60, then moved again, this time to a shell crater 100 yards east, partially filled with rainwater. He slid into the cold, muddy water until it reached his chest, rested the Winchester on the crater rim, and resumed scanning the trees. 10 confirmed kills. 1 sniper remaining. The 11th man would be the most dangerous, smartest, most experienced. He had watched 10 comrades die in 3 days. He knew George's tactics. He knew George's rifle. He knew George's approximate operating area. And somewhere in those trees, he was watching and waiting. George searched the canopy through his scope. The 2.5x magnification made distant shapes visible, but not easily identifiable. Every dark patch could be a man or a branch. Each one had to be studied carefully. At 9:47, George realized his mistake. The 11th sniper wasn't in the trees. He was on the ground, moving toward George's last known position. George caught movement at the edge of his peripheral vision. 60 yards south, low to the ground, a shape sliding through the undergrowth parallel to the tree line. The Japanese sniper was using jungle vegetation, ferns, vines, fallen branches for cover, crawling toward the rocks George had abandoned under machine gun fire. George remained motionless in the water-filled crater. The Winchester was already shouldered, but the angle was wrong. The crater rim blocked his view. To get a clean shot, he would have to rise up and expose himself. At 9:52, the sniper stopped. He had reached a position about 40 yards from the rocks. George watched through his scope as the man studied the rocks, searching for movement. George waited. Patience is the primary skill of a sniper. The ability to remain still, to let time pass, to wait for the right moment instead of forcing a bad shot. At 9:58, the Japanese sniper moved again. He crawled closer 35 yards from the rocks, then 30, then 25. He was approaching from the south, the same direction George had used to evacuate under fire. George understood the tactic. The sniper had watched the machine gun attack. He knew George had moved east from the rocks. Now he was working along the most likely escape route, hunting George the way George had hunted his comrades. At 10:03, the sniper reached the rocks and slid into the abandoned machine gun nest. He took up a position facing east, toward the drainage ditch where George should have been hiding. He was now 38 yards from George's actual position in the water-filled crater, but facing the wrong direction. His back was exposed. George had an easy shot center mass at 38 yards. But he hesitated. This man had survived 10 days of American operations in the Point Cruz groves. He had outlived 10 other snipers who had died because they made mistakes. This man did not make mistakes lightly. The position in the rocks was too exposed to hold for long. No experienced sniper would remain there more than a few seconds. It had to be another decoy. George kept his scope on the sniper in the rocks, but widened his attention, scanning for the real threat, someone covering the bait from another angle. At 10:06, he found him. A second Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest of the rocks, behind a fallen tree trunk. This man was not moving. He was simply watching, rifle aimed toward the drainage ditch where George was supposed to be. 2 men, not 1. The 11th sniper had brought support. Or perhaps these were the last 2 snipers, numbers 10 and 11, working together. George made his decision. He could not shoot both before they reacted. The bolt-action Winchester required him to cycle the action between shots, giving them time to locate him. He needed a different approach. He slowly lowered himself deeper into the water until only his eyes and the top of his head were above the surface. He kept the Winchester pointed upward to keep water out of the barrel, and waited. At 10:13, the Japanese soldier in the rocks stood up. After 10 minutes of watching the drainage ditch, he had seen no movement. He concluded George had moved farther east. He signaled to his partner behind the fallen tree. Both men began moving east, parallel to each other, about 70 yards apart, conducting a sweep to flush George out or find his new position. George stayed motionless in the water. The 2 soldiers passed his crater. They were now between him and the tree line, their backs exposed. George rose slowly from the water, lifting the Winchester to his shoulder. Mud and water dripped from his uniform and the rifle. He aimed at the closer man, the one from the rocks now 42 yards away. He fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt, chambered another round, and swung toward the second man behind the fallen tree. The soldier was turning, raising his rifle. George fired first. The second man fell. 11 shots over 3 days. 11 dead Japanese snipers. George had cleared the Point Cruz groves of the threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. As he climbed out of the crater, picking up spent cartridges, he heard something that made him freeze. Voices. Japanese voices from the tree line. Multiple men moving toward the fallen snipers. George had killed the snipers, but the snipers had not been working alone. He slid back into the crater. The water was cold and muddy. He submerged until only his eyes were exposed and kept the Winchester vertical to keep the barrel clear. The voices grew louder. At least 6 men, maybe more. Branches broke. Equipment rattled. This was not a sniper team. It was infantry, a patrol or recovery detail sent to collect bodies. The voices reached the first body, about 42 yards from the crater. He could hear them clearly now, even without understanding the words. Then the group moved to the second body. The tones grew urgent. At 10:28, the voices began moving again, this time toward George's crater. They had found his tracks, boot prints in the mud leading from the rocks to the crater. George had been careful about noise and movement. He had not been careful about tracks. He had 5 rounds in the Winchester and at least 6 Japanese infantry closing in. Poor odds with a bolt-action rifle. He considered his options. Stay hidden and hope they passed, or fight. The voices came closer 30 yards, then 25, then 20. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim. He looked straight down into the water and locked eyes with George. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. Still half submerged, George worked the bolt, chambered another round, and rose. 2 more soldiers were at the crater rim. He fired, cycled the bolt, fired again. Both men dropped. 3 rounds left. He could hear shouting. More soldiers were moving toward him. He climbed out of the crater on the north side, away from the approaching voices, and ran 20 yards to another fallen tree, diving behind it as rifle fire cracked through the jungle. Bullets chewed the ground around the crater and tore into the tree trunk. The Japanese were firing at movement and sound, not at confirmed targets. George stayed low, raised his scope, and scanned. 2 soldiers were advancing toward the crater, about 50 yards out. He aimed at the lead man and fired. The soldier dropped. The second dove for cover. 2 rounds left. More voices sounded behind him. The Japanese were flanking one group from the south, another from the east. He was about to be surrounded. George made his decision. He could not win a stand-up firefight with a bolt-action rifle against multiple opponents. He needed to break contact and get back to American lines. He grabbed his rifle and ran north through the undergrowth. Vines snagged his boots. Branches whipped his face. Rifle fire chased him, bullets snapping past, hitting trees and kicking up dirt. He ran for about 90 seconds before diving into another shell crater, this one dry. He pressed against the wall and listened. The voices were more distant now. The Japanese had not followed. They were regrouping around their dead. George checked his rifle. Mud on the stock. Water still dripping from the barrel. 2 rounds left. The rest of his ammunition was in his pack somewhere back near the water-filled crater. At 10:47, he began moving again, this time carefully, low to the ground, using terrain for cover. He angled northeast toward American lines. The jungle grew quiet, no voices, no movement, just his breathing and distant artillery. At 11:13, he reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him, then led him through after George identified himself. He walked straight to battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris. Morris wanted a full debrief. George laid it out. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds fired at snipers. 11 hits. Then the firefight with infantry. 5 rounds fired. 3 confirmed kills. Morris asked about ammunition status. George had 2 rounds left. The rifle? Functional, but dirty mud in the action. Water in the barrel. Morris told him to clean the rifle and rest. No operations tomorrow. The battalion was moving east. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. The Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal. Intelligence suggested they would complete their withdrawal within 2 weeks. George returned to his tent, field-stripped the Winchester, and spent 2 hours cleaning every component cosmoline residue, mud, and fouling. He ran patches through the barrel until they came out clean, checked the scope mounts, adjusted the eye relief, and loaded 5 fresh rounds. At 1400 hours, word came down from division. The regimental commander wanted to see him. George walked to headquarters expecting a reprimand, unauthorized engagement, excessive ammunition expenditure, operating alone without support. Instead, he found Captain Morris and 2 other officers, including Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry had a single question. Could George train other men to do what he had done? George said he could try, but he would need time, scoped rifles, and men who could already shoot. Ferry replied that division had 14 Springfield rifles with unertl scopes, Marine sniper rifles left behind on the island, and 40 men in the Founded Regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. He wanted George to create a sniper section, train the men, develop tactics, and clear any remaining Japanese snipers from American areas of operation. George agreed, with one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. Ferry approved. George kept his Winchester Model 70. The 14 scoped Springfields went to the men he would train. Training began on January 27th. George assembled 40 men at a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. On paper, they were expert marksmen. They had qualified with iron sights out to 500 yards. None had combat sniper experience. None had yet killed a man from concealment. George started with fundamentals: breathing control, trigger squeeze, reading wind. The Springfields, with unertl scopes, weighed around 11 pounds heavier than the Garand and heavier than George's Winchester. The extra weight made the rifles more stable, but fatiguing to hold in awkward jungle positions. George taught them to use any available support rocks, logs, sandbags. The jungle rarely offered ideal shooting platforms. Snipers had to improvise stable positions from whatever was available. Range training lasted 3 days. The men fired at stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards, then at moving targets, then at targets partially concealed by vegetation. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George divided those 32 into 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand. His job was to locate targets and provide security while the shooter engaged. After each kill, the roles could switch to keep both men proficient and avoid a single point of failure. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field. Their mission was to clear Japanese positions west of the Mataniko River. Intelligence reported small groups of Japanese infantry still operating their stragglers, not organized sniper units. The teams moved into position at dawn. George paired with a spotter named Corporal Hayes. They set up on high ground overlooking a trail used by the Japanese for resupply. At 7:20, a Japanese soldier appeared on the trail. Hayes confirmed the target through binoculars. George fired. The soldier dropped. No other targets emerged. Over the next 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 more Japanese soldiers on that trail 7 shots. 6 kills, 1 miss due to wind. The other 3 teams reported similar results. 23 Japanese soldiers killed in a single day. No American casualties. The sniper section continued operations through early February. By February 9th, they had 74 confirmed kills-only counting bodies they could see and verify. During this period, the Japanese evacuation accelerated. Destroyers arrived at night to pull troops off the western tip of Guadalcanal. American forces pushed west to disrupt the evacuation, but the Japanese fought effective rearguard actions. George's sniper section was tasked with eliminating Japanese covering forces along the retreat routes. On February 7th, near the Tanaru Tamanu Boga area, a Japanese rifleman shot George in the left shoulder. The bullet spun him around and knocked him down. Hayes dragged him to cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious, but not fatal. The bullet passed through muscle, without hitting bone or major vessels. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field. Doctors cleaned and sutured the wound, then told him he would recover but needed rest. No combat operations for at least 3 weeks. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital. During that time, the Japanese completed their evacuation. On February 9th, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. The Guadalcanal campaign was over. George's sniper section had operated for 12 days, 74 confirmed kills. 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. Division headquarters formally recognized the section. Colonel Ferry recommended George for the Bronze Star, but George's war was not over. While he recovered, orders arrived from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced combat officers for a new mission in Burma, details classified. George volunteered. By March, he was on a transport ship heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70 rode in a waterproof case in the cargo hold. The Lyman Alaskan scope was wrapped in oiled cloth. He still did not know the full details of the Burma mission, only that it involved jungle warfare, long-range patrols, and operations behind Japanese lines. The kind of mission where a man who could hit at 600 yards might be useful. The transport reached India on April 3rd. George and 200 other officers were briefed. They would join a new unit of about 3,000 men. It had no official name yet. Informally, the men called themselves Merrill's Marauders. The 5,307th Composite Unit, provisional. Merrill's Marauders was officially designated on May 28, 1943, but training had begun in April. The doctrine was long-range penetration, jungle survival, operating without supply lines, moving deep behind enemy positions. The unit was modeled on British Brigadier Ord Wingate's Chindit Small mobile forces operating far inside Japanese-held territory. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion. His official role was rifle platoon leader. The U.S. Army still had no formal sniper slots in its tables of organization, but Colonel Ferry's recommendation had followed him. Battalion command knew exactly what he could do with a rifle. Training took place in central India. The terrain differed from Guadalcanal, but the fundamentals were the same: heat, humidity, thick vegetation, limited visibility. Burma would be worse, steeper, wetter, with an enemy intimately familiar with the ground. George modified his equipment for Burma. The Winchester Model 70 had performed well on Guadalcanal, but those were relatively short-range engagements with regular resupply. Burma would mean weeks-long patrols, hundreds of miles through jungle. Every ounce of weight mattered. He removed the heavier Lyman Alaskan and replaced it with a lighter Weaver 330 scope with the same 2.5x magnification, but several ounces less weight. He also replaced the wooden stock with a lighter version. The modifications shaved the rifle's weight by nearly a pound. Not much on paper, but over a 2-week patrol with 60 pounds of gear, every ounce counted. The Marauders entered Burma in February 1944. Their mission: advance through northern Burma and capture the Muchina airfield, critical for Allied supply routes into China. Japanese forces in the area numbered around 4,000. The Marauders would approach overland through terrain the Japanese considered impassable for large formations mountains. Rivers, dense jungle, no roads, few trails. Supplies would go on pack mules and on the men's backs. No trucks, no heavy artillery, just rifles, light mortar, and the ability to move quickly where no one expected them to go. George's battalion began its march on February 24th. The first week covered 83 miles of mountainous jungle. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria cases mounted. Mules broke legs on steep slopes and had to be shot. By March, the battalion had covered 217 miles and engaged Japanese forces 12 times small skirmishes, ambushes, fast firefights, and rapid withdrawals. The Marauders were not there to hold ground. They were there to move, harass, cut supply lines, and create chaos behind Japanese lines. George used his Winchester 3 times during the march. Once at 412 yards against a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing. Once at 380 yards against a machine gun position. Once at 290 yards against a sniper pinning down a Marauder patrol. 3 shots, 3 kills. He never fired more than once in a single engagement. The Winchester's report sounded different from the Garand. One shot announced his presence. A second would give the Japanese time to locate him. He learned to fire and move immediately. The march to Muchina took 3 months. By late May, the marauders had covered over 700 miles. They lost more men to disease than to combat malaria, dysentery, typhus. The force that entered Burma with over 5,300 men was down to fewer than 3,000 fit for duty. On May 17th, the marauders captured Myitkyina airfield. The mission succeeded, but the unit was shattered. Too many casualties, too many sick, too long in the jungle without rest or proper medical care. George survived the Burma campaign. His Winchester survived. But the rifle that had been so decisive on Guadalcanal had fired only 7 combat shots in 3 months. Most Burma fighting took place at 50 yards or less close range, ambushes in thick vegetation where you could barely see 30 feet. He realized something in Burma. The Winchester Model 70 was an outstanding rifle, perhaps the best bolt-action sporting rifle in the world. But modern warfare was changing. Semi-automatic rifles like the Garand were becoming the standard. The next war would be fought with different weapons and tactics. For George, there would be no next war, at least not in the frontline sense. By June 1944, he was evacuated from Burma with the rest of the exhausted marauders. The unit was disbanded. George was reassigned to training duties in the United States. He never fired his Winchester in combat again. George returned to the United States in July 1944. The Army promoted him to captain and sent him to Fort Benning, Georgia, to train infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. He taught what he had learned on Guadalcanal and in Burma, how to move through jungle terrain, how to identify and engage targets at distance, how to operate independently without reliable supply lines. He kept his Winchester Model 70. The rifle had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee to Guadalcanal to India to Burma to Georgia. It had at least 14 confirmed kills, probably more. After Burma, George stopped counting. The rifle sat in a footlocker in his quarters at Fort Benning. He rarely looked at it. The war was changing quickly. Pacific Islands falling one by one. American forces advancing through France into Germany. The era of individual marksmen with privately owned rifles was ending. The Army was standardizing on mass-produced weapons, interchangeable parts, and uniform training. George understood the necessity. Industrial warfare demanded industrial solutions. But something was lost in the process, the craftsman's approach to soldiering, the idea that a single man with the right rifle and the right training could change the course of a battle. George was discharged from the Army in January 1947 as a lieutenant colonel. 2 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart, Combat Infantryman Badge. He returned to Illinois and enrolled at Princeton University on the GI Bill, studying politics and graduating with highest honors in 1950. After Princeton, he spent 4 years at Oxford, then 4 years in British East Africa, studying regional politics and institutions. He eventually settled in Washington, D.C., as executive director of the Institute of African American Relations. Later, he joined the State Department's Foreign Service Institute as a consultant and lecturer on African affairs. In those years, George rarely spoke publicly about Guadalcanal or Burma. Colleagues knew he had served in the Pacific, but they did not know about Point Cruz. They did not know about the Japanese snipers. They did not know about the Winchester Model 70 sitting in a case in his home. In 1947, George made a decision. He would write it down not for publication, just as a record. He wanted to document the weapons and tactics of jungle warfare while the details were still fresh. He wrote for 6 months. The manuscript grew to over 400 pages. A friend at the National Rifle Association read it and urged him to publish. George was reluctant. The book was highly technical rifles, cartridges, ballistics, not exactly mainstream material. The NRA convinced him. The book, Shots Fired in Anger, was published in 1947. It became a classic among firearms enthusiasts and military historians. George described his experiences in Guadalcanal and Burma with clinical precision, no embellishment, no hero worship, just facts and observations about what worked and what did not in real combat. The book remains in print and is still used as a reference by collectors and historians studying World War II small arms. His descriptions of Japanese weapons are among the most detailed contemporary accounts. George lived to see the United States fight 3 more major wars: Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War. He watched the evolution of military rifles from the Garand to the M14 to the M16. He watched sniping become a formal military specialty with dedicated schools and equipment. He watched lessons from World War II being relearned and refined by new generations of soldiers. John George died on January 3, 2009, at the age of 90. The Winchester Model 70 that had killed Japanese snipers on Guadalcanal was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. Today, it sits in a display case with a small placard explaining its history. Most visitors walk past without stopping. It looks like any other vintage hunting rifle. But it is not. It is the rifle that proved a state champion marksman with a mail-order scope could outshoot professionally trained military snipers. The rifle that cleared the Point Cruz groves in 4 days when an entire battalion could not do it in 2 weeks. The rifle that helped change how the American military thought about individual marksmanship in modern warfare. If this story moved you, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this history to more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives, stories of riflemen who proved themselves with skill and courage. Real people. Real heroism. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping ensure John George does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.